The wind came down from the white mountains like a knife blade, slicing through the valley and tearing at the edges of silence. It carried the smell of pine smoke and old grief straight into a wooden cabin crouched beneath the trees. That cabin belonged to a man everyone called Dury. Once, he'd had a longer name, a name that used to be spoken with laughter. But since the winter his wife had died, no one said it anymore. Now he was just die short, rough, and quiet, like the sound of an axe biting into wood. His 5 sons were wild sparks scattered from the same fire. The eldest, 16, silent and hard-jawed. The second, 14, a storm with fists. The third, 12, quick but secretive. And the twin boys at the end, small whirlwinds who could turn any chore into a mess. They weren't bad children, only lost ones lost since their mother's songs had stopped echoing off the walls. Her hands had once kept order with gentleness. Without them, the house had come apart like a rope left too long in the rain. That evening, the stew boiled over again. Di snatched the lid, steam burning his palm. He didn't curse from pain, but from that same old helplessness that lived in his chest. He'd faced wolves and storms and starvation, but nothing had taught him how to keep 5 restless hearts from breaking everything they touched. He slammed the table and shouted enough. The noise fell away for a heartbeat, then laughter, a crash, and the sharp snap of wood brought it roaring back. He looked toward the wall where his wife had once stood, stirring a pot and humming a tune that smelled of cinnamon and honey. He remembered her voice saying, "They're just boys. Don't use fear to teach them." But fear was all he had left. It filled the cracks where her laughter used to live. He sent the boys outside into the snow, and when the door closed, the house felt hollow again. He sat in the chair and rested his head on his hand, hoping if he stayed still long enough, the winter would pass through him, instead of breaking him. Outside, the boys shouted and threw snowballs, their laughter echoing faint and far. He added another log to the stove. The fire spat and hissed, a stubborn little beast trying to keep the dark at bay. Down at the foot of the slope, faint footprints marked the snow tiny ones, spaced unevenly. A small girl, coat too big, scarf frayed, trudged uphill with a bundle clutched tight against her chest. Her name was May. She had no horse, no parents, no plan, only a stubborn hope. Someone in town had once mentioned the cabin of a mountain man with 5 wild sons, and no woman who'd lasted a day there. That was enough for her. She'd lived in the orphanage long enough to know what loneliness sounded like. Boots on stone, the echo of doors that locked from the outside. People there weren't cruel, just busy. She'd once heard a shopkeeper laugh, saying no one was fool enough to stay in that mountain cabin. May had turned those words over in her head like a pebble in her pocket. Maybe, she thought, they just need someone not to be afraid. Before she left, she baked a loaf of bread in a borrowed stove, hard on one side, uneven on the other, but warm. She wrapped it in a piece of cloth along with a handful of dried wildflowers she'd kept from summer. Then she set out before dawn, following the thread of the frozen creek and the line of cedar trees until the forest began to thin. By the time she reached the clearing, the sky was a low gray lid. Smoke twisted from the chimney like a tired ribbon. The fence leaned, the yard scattered with broken toys and footprints. She could hear voices inside, loud and overlapping, like thunder in a tin roof. May stood at the edge of the yard, clutching her bundle, whispering to herself, "Just knock, and if no one opens, knock again." The door was rough beneath her mitten. She knocked once. Nothing. Again. Louder. Footsteps. Then the door swung wide, wind rushing between them. The man who filled the doorway looked like part of the mountain itself, tall, shoulders broad, beard crusted with frost, eyes dark and tired. He frowned. "You lost, girl." May shook her head. She held up her bundle, voice small but steady. "No, "Sir, I came to help." Behind him, 5 boys peered out, their faces streaked with soot and curiosity. The second oldest snorted. "She's smaller than the twins." The twins giggled, but May didn't flinch. She unwrapped her bundle, showing the loaf of bread. "I can't carry heavy buckets yet," she said softly, "but I can keep a fire burning, and I can help people forget to be afraid of the night." The man looked down at her hands, raw from the cold, then at the bread still holding a little warmth. Behind him the cabin waited, cluttered and dim, smelling of smoke and ash. Any grown woman would have wrinkled her nose or turned away. May only smiled and whispered, "It's warm." Something in that word made him pause. No one had called this house warm in years. Outside, the wind rattled the leather strips hanging from the eaves. The man stepped aside without another word. May stepped across the threshold as if into a church. The floor creaked under her small boots. Warmth met her face like a shy welcome. Half smoke, half stew. The room was chaos, chairs knocked sideways, tools mixed with toys, socks drying on the mantel, but she didn't look disgusted. Instead, she breathed in softly and said, "Smells like someone's been trying." The boys stared at her, half mocking, half unsure. The smallest twin tugged at her sleeve. "What's in your bundle?" She opened it again, revealing the loaf of bread, now cracked but golden. She set it gently on the table. "It's not much, but food tastes better when it's shared." None of them moved. The second boy, Eli, crossed his arms, his mouth twisting. "You think you can fix us with bread?" May smiled. "No, but it's a good place to start." Behind them, Di leaned against the wall, arms folded. He hadn't meant to let her stay even this long, but something in her calm voice held him still. She reminded him of a quiet song he used to know, the kind that softened the edges of a bad day. The youngest twin, Sammy, crept closer, sniffed the bread, then tore off a piece and stuffed it in his mouth. His eyes widened, warm. The others followed without a word. Soon there was chewing, crumbs, and a silence that felt strange, peaceful. May chewed too, politely, her hands folded on her lap. Afterward, she stood and began picking up things from the floor: wood chips, spoons, a half-mended boot. Di watched, unsure whether to stop her or thank her. He finally said, "You don't have to do that." She shrugged. "I like when things can breathe." The room shifted. Even the fire seemed to lean closer. Later, when dusk painted the windows blue, May asked if she could wash. Dishy nodded toward the basin near the door. She rolled up her sleeves and scrubbed, humming under her breath. The boys, curious, gathered around. "What song's that, Luke?" The quiet one asked. "A song my mama sang when she wanted us not to be scared." May said, "It means things will be all right, even when they're not yet." The boys said nothing, but their eyes softened. The tune lingered like a small lamp in the dim room. As night came, Dee sat by the stove, mending a handle. May dried her hands and looked around. Where should I sleep? The question startled him. Sleep he'd meant for her to rest a bit, then send her back to town in the morning. But she was looking at him with steady eyes, not pleading, just waiting. "There's an old cot in the corner," he muttered. "You can have it till dawn." May nodded. She laid her shawl over the cot, then turned to the boys. "Do you always shout so loud?" "Sometimes," Ben said, grinning. "Maybe tomorrow we try something else. Maybe we listen instead," May said. The twins snickered. Eli rolled his eyes, but none of them argued. When the lamps were blown out, the cabin held a silence Dee hadn't heard in years, not empty, but full of breathing. He sat long after they'd all fallen asleep, staring at the girl curled on the cot, her small hand clutching the edge of her shawl. In the faint firelight, she looked fragile, like one more gust might carry her away. Yet somehow, she'd walked up a mountain alone. That thought made him uneasy and curious all at once. The next morning dawned pale and cold. Frost laced the window. Di was up early, stirring the thin porridge while the boys wrestled in the corner. May appeared quietly, her hair damp from washing, sleeves rolled to her elbows. She began setting the mismatched bowls without being told. "Don't touch that," Eli barked when she reached for his spoon. She looked at him, calm as a pond. "Do you want it clean or just yours?" He blinked, unsure how to answer. They ate in silence at first. Then Sammy whispered, "Are you staying?" "May." She smiled faintly. "I'll stay until someone smiles back." Even Di couldn't help the short breath that escaped him, a sound almost like a laugh, but not quite. After breakfast, the boys decided to test her. Ben hid a frog in her boot. Eli poured flour in her hair. Luke tied her shawl high in the rafters. Dee didn't stop them. Part of him wanted to know what she was made of. When she found the frog, she didn't scream. She giggled and carried it outside. "You don't belong in boots, little one," she whispered, setting it near the creek. When the flour fell in her hair, she brushed it away and said, "Now I look like snow." And when she saw her shawl hanging high above, she laughed. "Well, it's resting. Everything gets tired sometimes." By evening, the boys didn't know what to do with her quiet cheer. It unnerved them, then began to calm them. They argued less. The house felt different. As the fire burned low, May sat by the hearth humming again. The boys leaned in to listen. Di, pretending not to watch, felt something shift inside him, something he'd buried beside his wife. Before turning in, he asked softly, "You planning to stay long, girl?" May looked up. The firelight caught in her eyes. "I'll stay until this place feels like home." Outside, snow began to fall again, slow and soft, like the world agreeing. The next days unfolded slowly, like a thaw that didn't know it was happening. Mornings came with the sound of laughter instead of shouting, though sometimes the laughter was still wild and uneven, like horses that hadn't yet learned to trust the reins. May rose early, long before the boys, to sweep ashes from the hearth and set water to boil. She hummed while she worked, not because she was happy, but because the sound filled spaces that used to echo. The boys began to join her, one by one. Ben and Sammy tried to help carry wood, dropping half of it along the way. Eli pretended not to care, yet he sharpened the knives she used for cooking. Luke watched everything she did, quiet and wide-eyed, while Caleb, the oldest, kept to himself, though May sometimes caught him glancing over from the doorway when he thought no one noticed. Di watched too, in his own way. He told himself he was just making sure the girl didn't cause trouble. But deep down he knew she was the first calm the house had seen in years. Still, he couldn't quite understand her. No complaint, no fear, no flinching. He'd seen grown women cry at less. One afternoon, the wind picked up and brought with it a brittle kind of cold that hinted at snow. May was outside with the twins, teaching them how to hang laundry so it wouldn't freeze stiff. She was laughing when a sleeve slapped her face. He saw from the porch and caught himself smiling before he realized it. He looked away quickly, but the warmth lingered, stubborn as the smell of pine smoke on his coat. Later that night, as the family gathered around the fire, May opened a small bundle she'd kept near her cot. Inside were a few wrinkled pages torn from an old book. The ink faded. "What's that?" Caleb asked. "Stories," she said softly. "My mama used to read them." She smoothed one page and began to read aloud. Her voice was light but steady, weaving pictures into the air of a boy lost in the woods who found his way home by following the sound of kindness. The boys grew quiet. Even Eli, who usually scoffed at anything gentle. He sat back, arms crossed, pretending to rest his eyes. When May finished, she folded the paper carefully. The silence that followed wasn't heavy like before. It was full of breath and thought. Caleb leaned forward. "Can you teach me to read like that?" he said. May smiled, her teeth white in the firelight. "If you want to." And he did. By the end of the week, the cabin had changed in ways no one had planned. Chores were still messy, the floor still scattered with boots, but there was a rhythm now, a pulse that felt alive. Even the dog, an old hound that had long since stopped caring, began sleeping by the hearth again. One morning, Di woke to the sound of May's voice outside, soft but urgent. "Come on, Sammy. One more step." He went to the window and saw her helping the youngest twin across the icy yard, her hands steady on his shoulders. When the boy slipped, she laughed instead of scolding, and he laughed too. They felt something stir in his chest, something warm, fragile, and frightening. That evening, clouds began to thicken over the ridge. The light turned copper, and the air felt tight, as if the world was holding its breath. "Do you know the signs?" "Storm's coming," he muttered. He told the boys to bring in the firewood, double the stack, and latch the shutters. By nightfall, snow was swirling hard enough to erase the trees. The wind screamed around the cabin like an animal trapped in its own rage. The boys huddled close to the fire while Di checked the roof beams. "Keep that flame steady," he ordered. "Don't let it die." May sat near the hearth, eyes wide but calm. She'd never seen a storm this fierce, when the back window suddenly burst inward with a crack. Snow blasted through the room, dousing the fire halfway. Eli shouted, "Pa, the window's out!" Before Di could move, May had already leapt up, grabbed a thick quilt from her cot, and ran toward the broken window. The wind nearly knocked her down. Di shouted, "Stay back," but she pressed the quilt against the opening with all her small weight. Snow whipped her face, her hair plastered with frost. Di rushed over and caught her by the arm, pulling her away from the blast. "You'll freeze, fool girl." She looked up at him, trembling but determined. "It's the boys' room, sir," she said. "They'll be cold." For a long second, the storm raged around them, but neither moved. Then he wrapped his coat around her small shoulders. "Come on," he said roughly. "We'll fix it together." They worked through the night. Caleb and Eli nailed boards over the gap, while Luke fed rags into the cracks. May kept the fire alive, feeding it whatever she could find: wood, paper, even one of her story pages. "Stories can wait," she whispered, tossing it in. "Warmth can't." By midnight, the storm was a living thing, clawing and howling. The roof groaned, rafters creaked. Di gathered the boys close to the hearth, May tucked between them. She looked up, sleepy-eyed, at the roaring sky and murmured, "It sounds like the heavens are singing." They blinked at her. "Singing," she nodded. "Maybe God's just reminding us he's still here." And for the first time in years, Dee believed that might be true. When morning finally came, it was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like a held breath after too much shouting. Snow covered everything, half the door included. Icicles hung from the roof like knives. Inside, the fire had burned low, glowing faint red beneath the ashes. The boys slept in a heap of blankets and arms, their faces soft again, unguarded. May was curled between them, her hair stuck to her cheek, one hand still gripping a corner of the burnt quilt. He sat awake, his back against the wall, eyes tracing the slow rise and fall of each small chest. He hadn't meant to stay up, but something inside him refused to rest. He kept seeing her standing in that storm, tiny body pressed against the wind, holding the cold at bay with nothing but courage. He had known grown men who broke easier. He rose quietly, pushed the door open with his shoulder, and stepped outside. The world was white and new, as if the night had wiped it clean. The valley below shimmered under a pale sun. Smoke curled from the chimney, thin but steady. For the first time in years, he felt like the house was alive, not just standing. Back inside, he found May stirring awake. She blinked up at him, dazed, then smiled, her lips cracked but bright. "Did we make it?" she asked. He nodded. "You did good, girl. You did better than most grown folk would have." She rubbed her eyes. "Everyone's safe. That's all that matters." He couldn't think of an answer, so he busied himself feeding the fire. The boys woke soon after, loud and hungry, already retelling the night like an adventure. Eli insisted he'd held the boards by himself. Ben claimed he'd fought the wind with his bare hands. May laughed and let them have their stories. For the rest of that day, no one worked much. They dried quilts, patched windows, and drank hot water flavored with a pinch of sugar May had saved in her pocket. Di caught himself whistling once, then stopped, embarrassed, but the tune hung in the air anyway. Days turned into weeks. Winter softened its grip. The river cracked and began to move again. May stayed, as if she'd always belonged. She cleaned, mended, taught, and listened. Sometimes she told stories from memory. Other times, she made them up. The boys followed her around like she was a lantern they didn't want to lose. Di found himself changing too, though he didn't say it out loud. He shouted less. He started fixing things instead of throwing them out. One night, he even taught the twins how to carve wooden spoons, his voice gentler than he'd meant it to be. Caleb, the oldest, came to him one evening, scratching his neck awkwardly. "Pa, can I keep reading that book with May?" Dee nodded. "You can." Caleb looked relieved, almost smiling. Outside, the snow retreated inch by inch, revealing the brown earth underneath. Spring, slow but certain, crept down from the ridge. With it came small things, the smell of damp pine, a bird call in the morning, the faint laughter that carried through the trees. One afternoon, Di stepped outside to chop wood. He paused mid-swing when he heard something different, a soft, even laughter, like sunlight. He turned toward the window. Through the frost glass, he could see May sitting on the floor with the boys gathered close. She'd found an old box of books that had belonged to Martha, his late wife. The sight made his chest tighten. For years, he couldn't bear to touch those books. They'd sat in the corner, gathering dust, like ghosts too kind to leave. And now this little girl was bringing them back to life. "Inside," she read aloud, her voice lifting gently through the room. "This one's about a boy who thought he was too wild to be loved," she said, but someone showed him he wasn't. The twins listened with wide eyes. Eli tried to hide his interest, but leaned closer anyway. Caleb followed the words with his finger, mouthing them under his breath. He set down his axe and watched through the window, the cold air burning his lungs. When she finished, she handed the book to Caleb. "You can read the next part tomorrow," she told him. He hesitated. "I don't read so good." "Then we'll learn together," she said. "That's what families do." The word hit Di like a hammer. Family. He hadn't heard it spoken in that house since Martha's funeral. That night, when the boys were asleep, May came to sit beside him on the porch. She wrapped her thin shawl tight and stared up at the stars. "You don't talk much, Mr. Di," she said softly. "Ain't much worth saying," he muttered. "You don't have to talk much to be kind," she replied. He looked at her, the smallest thing on the mountain, yet somehow unafraid. "You know," she continued, "your boys love you. They just don't know how to show it. My mama used to say when people act mean, it's mostly 'cause they're hurting." He rubbed a hand over his face. "Your mama sounds like she knew plenty." "She did," May whispered. "She used to say kindness is like firewood. The more you give, the warmer everyone gets." He stared into the firelight, thinking of Martha, of how she used to say nearly the same thing. Inside, the boys began to argue again, this time over who got to sit closest to the fire. Their voices weren't angry, just young and full of life. May smiled and stood. "I'll make them cocoa," she said. "Want some too?" He shook his head, watching her go. She was just a child, poor and small, but she had done what he couldn't. She'd turned 5 wild hearts and 1 broken man into a family again. Later, as the fire crackled low and snow whispered against the windows, he found himself sitting beside the boys, listening as May read another story. Her voice was soft, steady, and bright. By the time she finished, the twins were asleep on her arms, and even Eli looked peaceful. Di leaned back, eyes closed, and thought, maybe the mountain wasn't cursed after all. Maybe it had just been waiting for her. The mountain began to thaw in earnest, and with it came a kind of light the Boone cabin hadn't seen in years. The snow melted from the roof in slow tears. The earth turned soft and black, and small green shoots pushed up beside the porch. Winter had been long, but life was stubborn. May stayed. She didn't talk about leaving, and no one asked her to. She slipped into their days the way spring slipped into the valley quietly, without permission. Every morning, she fed the chickens with the twins, showed Luke how to spell his name in the dirt, and helped Eli patch the holes in his shirts with crooked stitches. Even Caleb, who once kept his distance, sat beside her in the evenings, sounding out words by the firelight. They would sometimes stop in the doorway and just watch. The sound of her voice, the rhythm of her small hands moving, made something inside him ache in a good way. He still didn't quite understand what miracle had sent her to his mountain, but he'd stopped questioning it. Then one morning, the rhythm shifted. Di was out splitting logs when he saw a dark figure moving up the trail. At first, he thought it was a bear. Then the glint of metal caught the sun, a horseman, climbing toward the cabin. Strangers didn't visit, not up here. The rider stopped near the porch, a lean man with a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. "You Jed Boone," he called. Di nodded slowly. "What of it?" "Got a letter for you, from town." The man handed it over, tipped his hat, and rode off before Di could ask anything else. Inside, May and the boys were setting the table for breakfast. The smell of corn mush and wood smoke filled the air. Di walked in, the envelope heavy in his hand. May noticed his face and went still. "Who's it from?" Pa Caleb asked. Di turned the envelope over. The seal read Cedar Creek Orphan Office. He felt his chest tighten as he tore it open. His eyes moved down the neat black letters, slow and heavy. By the time he reached the bottom, his jaw had locked. "They're looking for her," he said quietly. May blinked. "For me?" Di nodded. "Says here you ran off 5 months back. They want you returned." The room fell silent. Even the fire seemed to hush. The twins froze mid-bite. Luke's spoon clattered. "They can't take her, Pa," Eli said, voice rising. "She belongs here." Ben clung to May's sleeve, eyes wide. "You ain't going, right?" May just stood there, trembling. I didn't mean to run. I just wanted to help." Her voice broke. "I thought maybe somebody needed me." He crouched down in front of her, his rough hands resting on his knees. "Listen to me, little one. You didn't do wrong. You gave us more than we ever thought we'd have." "Then why do I have to go?" she whispered. He opened his mouth, but no words came. He looked down at the letter again, rules and orders, ink written by people who'd never seen this cabin, never felt what it meant to belong here. That night, the house was silent again, the kind of silence that cut deep. May sat near the hearth holding one of Martha's old books against her chest. The boys huddled close, not knowing what to say. Even the fire burned low, as if mourning with them. Di sat in his chair, staring at her, her small frame. The way her hair caught the glow, it all felt like something he couldn't lose. Not again. After a long while, she looked up. "You don't have to worry, Mr. Boone. I'll go back tomorrow. They'll take me in again." He shook his head. "It ain't that simple." "You already gave me what I needed," she said. "And what's that?" he asked, his voice rough. "A home," she whispered. He looked away quickly, his throat burning. He wanted to tell her to stay, to promise her she'd never leave. But the law didn't bend for a mountain man's heart. He stayed there long after she fell asleep. The letter crumpled in his hand, thinking of every storm he'd ever survived and wondering if this one might break him for good. When the fire burned down to embers, he finally whispered into the dark, "You're not leaving. Lucy May. Not if I can help it." By dawn, he'd made up his mind. He saddled his horse before the boys woke. May's small satchel sat by the door, neatly packed. She was ready, because she'd promised herself she wouldn't make it harder for them. When Dee stepped outside, she stood there, pale and quiet, her hands clasped. "Stay with the boys," he said. "I'll be back before sundown." Then he turned his horse toward the valley and rode out, the letter tucked in his coat, the morning mist swallowing his trail. The mountain air was sharp and cold, but his thoughts were hotter than fire. Every hoofbeat pounded with the same truth: he couldn't let the world take her. He'd lost one woman he loved to death and 5 sons to grief. He wasn't losing this child to paper. By the time he reached town, the sun was high. Cedar Creek was small, its streets muddy from the thaw. Townsfolk stopped to stare as the mountain man dismounted and walked straight toward a narrow wooden building with a sign over the door, "Orphan Office." Inside, a woman in a stiff gray dress looked up from her desk. "Can I help you, sir?" Di dropped the letter on the counter. "You sent this." She adjusted her spectacles. "Yes, about the runaway girl, Lucy May. You found her then." "She found me," he said. The woman blinked. "Excuse me." "She found me and my boys. Been living with us for months. Fed them. Taught them. She's the reason that cabin's still standing." "Mr. Boone, the law is clear," the woman said. "She's a ward of the state." His voice hardened. "Then tell me what papers I need. Adoption, guardianship, whatever it takes." The woman hesitated. "That's a long process." "Then start it," he said. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking clock on the wall. Finally, she reached for a file. "You'll need a witness," she said. From the doorway came a familiar voice. "Reckon I can be that," the sheriff said, leaning against the frame. "About time someone gave that little girl a proper home." And for the first time in months, Dice smiled, small but real. He signed the papers with a steady hand. When he left the office, the air outside felt cleaner, sharper, alive. He swung onto his horse and turned back toward the mountain, where smoke rose from the chimney that no longer marked a lonely house, but a home waiting for its child. The sun was sinking behind the peaks when Di rode back up the trail. His horse snorted steam into the cold air, hooves crunching the half-melted snow. Ahead, the familiar outline of the cabin came into view, dark against the pink sky. Smoke curled from the chimney in slow, tired spirals. He could see movement on the porch, small shapes, waiting. The boys were the first to spot him. They came running down the slope, boots kicking up wet snow, shouting his name. May stayed where she was, sitting on the top step, her hands clasped tight in her lap, afraid to hope. Di dismounted and stood for a long moment, the mountain wind tugging at his coat. His face was rough with cold, but his eyes were softer than anyone had seen in years. "Well," he said finally, "looks like I had some papers signed." May blinked, confused. Papers. He crouched down so he was eye level with her. "Since you're a boon now, if you'll have the name." Her mouth fell open. "You mean I can stay?" He nodded. "If you're willing, little one." She didn't answer right away. She just threw her arms around his neck, sobbing into his coat. The boys cheered, shouting over one another, their voices echoing through the valley like music. Even the old hound barked, tail thumping the porch. Di held her close, his arms wrapping around that small frame that had somehow brought his whole world back together. "You turned this place into a home," he murmured. "Guess it's only right you stay in it." That night, the cabin glowed like a lantern on the mountainside. Laughter filled the air, the wild, bright kind that comes from relief, not mischief. The boys jostled around the fire as May read from one of Martha's old books, her voice steady and warm. Dee sat back in his chair, listening, his rough hands resting easy on his knees. When she finished, Sammy whispered, "One more story." "Tomorrow," she smiled. "Stories sound better when you've lived another day." Later, after everyone had drifted to bed, Di stepped outside. The stars were sharp and endless above him. For the first time since Martha died, the night didn't feel empty. It felt full of breath, of laughter, of belonging. He looked back at the cabin, the faint flicker of firelight still glowing through the window. She was in there, tucked between the boys, her shawl folded neatly beside her. His sons were sleeping easier now. The mountain, once silent and cruel, felt kind again. He thought of Martha, of the promise he'd never made but should have to keep the family whole, no matter what. "Well, Martha," he whispered into the wind, "looks like someone kept it for me." The days that followed passed gently. The thaw quickened, the stream ran loud again, and the valley began to hum with life. May's laughter mingled with the boys' voices, rising above the fields like birdsong. She planted herbs by the window, patched the boys' torn sleeves, and taught Caleb to read proper chapters now, not just words. In the evenings, Di caught her humming to herself, that same tune from her first night there, the one that meant everything's going to be all right. And it was. One afternoon, while fixing the fence, Dee heard footsteps behind him. May stood there with a mug of water too big for her small hands. "You missed a spot," she said, pointing to the loose rail. He smirked. "You sound like your ma." She grinned. "I never had one long enough to sound like her. Maybe I sound like me." He nodded slowly. "Maybe that's better." They worked side by side for a while, in silence but not loneliness. The mountain wind was soft that day, carrying the scent of pine sap and damp soil. The snow was almost gone, only a few bright patches clinging to the shade. "You ever scared?" May asked after a while. She thought about it. Not much anymore. She said, "Storms don't stay forever." He looked down at her, that fearless little face turned up toward him, and smiled, a real one, the kind that felt strange on his lips but good in his chest. Toward evening, as the sky turned the color of copper, they sat on the porch steps watching the boys chase the dog through the yard. The twins were shrieking with laughter, Eli trying to pretend he wasn't smiling, Luke trailing behind with a stick like it was a sword. Caleb sat on the fence, reading aloud in a slow, careful voice. May leaned her head against Di's arm. "You think they'll remember this?" she asked. He looked at her, then at the valley below, gold in the setting sun. "I reckon they will," he said. "And if they forget, you'll remind them." She laughed softly. "I will." The evening settled around them, quiet and wide. The first fireflies of spring winked among the grass, and the mountain breathed easy again. Inside, on the mantel, the old photograph of Martha still stood, her smile faded but not gone. Beside it, Di had placed a new one, taken by a traveling preacher who'd stopped by weeks later, 6 boys, a bearded man, and a girl with her hair in braids, all squinting into the sun. Below it, carved into the wood, was a single word: family. Summer came to the mountains slow and golden. Grass filled the clearings where snow once lay heavy, and the air smelled of sap and sun-warmed wood. The creek that had frozen solid in winter now sang all day, tumbling past smooth stones and under the bridge the boys had built with Di's help. In the evenings, fireflies drifted through the yard like drifting sparks from an unseen fire. Life at the Boone cabin found its rhythm. Chores had become less about survival and more about living. May woke first most mornings, letting the sunlight spill across the wooden floor as she swept, humming the same soft tune that had carried her through storms and sorrow. The boys tumbled in behind her, loud as ever, but now their noise had laughter in it, not anger. That summer, the garden behind the cabin bloomed wild. May and Luke had planted beans, carrots, and a few sunflowers that grew taller than Sammy. They laughed when the wind bent them sideways, May calling them the mountain's flags. The boys teased her, but every evening they'd stand and measure who'd grown faster, the flowers or them. Sometimes travelers came up the trail. Word had spread in Cedar Creek about the mountain man who adopted the runaway girl. Some came out of curiosity, others with respect. One old preacher brought a camera, a boxy thing that clicked like a cricket. He asked if he could take their picture. Di almost said no. He wasn't one for posing, but May tugged his sleeve. "Please," she whispered. "It'll make Mama Martha happy up there." So they stood in the yard, 6 boys and 1 small girl, their boots caked in mud, the dog sitting proudly in front. Dee stood behind them, hand resting on May's shoulder. The preacher counted down, and at the last second, May grinned so wide it made everyone else smile too. When the picture came out days later, Di carved a frame for it himself. He placed it beside Martha's old photograph on the mantel. The two faces, the woman who had built the home and the child who had rebuilt it, seemed to belong together. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched across the yard, Dee found May sitting by the creek, tossing pebbles into the water. He sat down beside her, the boards creaking under his weight. "You look like you're thinking too hard," he said. She smiled faintly, "Just wondering if my mama can see me from heaven." He looked out over the water. "Reckon she can," he said. "And if she can't, God's telling her all about you." May nodded, quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I used to think God forgot about me." Di's voice came low and steady. He didn't forget. He was just waiting for the right mountain. She laughed softly at that, then leaned her head on his arm. The world moved slow up there, but every day brought small changes, the kind that mattered. Caleb read through all the books in the box and started teaching the twins their letters. Eli built a birdhouse so crooked that the birds still chose it anyway. Luke carved a whistle that sounded like the wind through the pines, and May, always in the middle of them, was the heart that kept the rhythm. As the season turned, the nights grew long again, but no one feared them now. The cabin that had once groaned with storms was warm with stories. The boys told them around the fire about the blizzard, about the frog in the boot, about how May had made their paws smile again. Sometimes they even argued about who'd found her first that day at the door. And May would laugh, covering her face with her hands. "You didn't find me," she'd say. "I found you." One night, as the fire burned low and the boys dozed off one by one, Di looked around the room. Caleb's head rested on a book. Eli snored softly, the twins tangled in a blanket. Luke had fallen asleep mid-sentence. May sat between them all, her hair lit by the last of the flames. She noticed him watching and smiled. "You're quiet again," she whispered. He chuckled. "Guess I'm still learning how to talk in a full house." She reached over, placed her small hand on his. "You don't need to talk much. Mr. Boone, this house already knows what you mean." He looked at her, the girl who had walked up the mountain with nothing but a loaf of bread and courage, and felt that same weightless warmth he'd felt the first night she'd knocked on his door. Outside, the wind stirred the pines, gentle this time, like a lullaby. The mountain had seen grief, loss, and silence, but now it carried laughter that rolled down its slopes like river water. The stars hung low over the cabin, reflecting in the creek where May's pebbles still slept beneath the current. And in that quiet, living night, he thought to himself that sometimes God's mercy doesn't come as thunder or miracle. It comes as a small girl who knocks twice on a cold door and decides to stay. Inside, the last log broke and fell in the fire, sending sparks drifting upward like tiny prayers. The cabin glowed faintly in the dark, no longer a lonely man's refuge, but a home where love had learned to live again.